Hello, Garland Nixon here. I'm here with Joti Brar, and we're going to discuss the World Anti-imperialist Forum. Generally, people ask me, what is your ideology? And I say, I'm a lefty. I don't claim any ideology whatsoever, but I will always argue that I'm an anti-imperialist. I'm opposed to empire. I believe in a just and stable world. Foreign policy to me should be about stability and justice. Everyone has the same expectation of rights, and we got to look out for the working class, the working poor, and the poor who get overlooked all too often as the ruling elite have their way with us. Joti, the Anti-Imperialist Forum sounds good to me. What is it? What does it mean? And is it an organization? Is it a platform? What do we need to know about it?
So really, Garland, thank you for having me on, by the way. Really, the World Anti-imperialist Platform was founded in response to a growing realization on behalf of people like me that the war, or the escalation of war in Ukraine, the proxy war that's been going on actually for 9 years now, 8 years before the special military operation started, that escalation had brought into very clear clarity the fact that there's a big division amongst people who consider themselves left, socialist, anti-imperialist, in their understanding of what imperialism is, and therefore what's the nature of this war, and therefore whose side should we be telling people to be on. And this has become the crucial question of our time, Garland, in fact, and it's dividing the entire world, and it's dividing the left movement very deeply because there's a lack of understanding of what imperialism really is. And imperialism has become, with this lack of theoretical clarity, imperialism has become just a swear word.
Right.
People use to frighten each other. Like, oh, you can't side with Russia because they're imperialists. And you, oh gosh, I don't like imperialism, so I won't. But without any understanding of what does it mean, imperialism, then you can't defend yourself against these kind of constant slurs that come around. And now the imperialists themselves, NATO, the USA, Britain, they are slinging this term at the people they're attacking, right? And they start to bring in what used to be Marxist terminology about colonialism. They talk about decolonizing Russia. What are they talking about? It's code for breaking up Russia, but they're using terminology that makes kind of left-wingers, people who identify as socialist or even communist, it makes them feel that they're on the side of NATO in this war against Russia. So really, we saw this kind of big confusion, and we saw that two camps were emerging in the left about what side to be on and how to characterize the war. And really, our aim is to bring clarity with evidence and to bring together all of those who are clear in their understanding that one side is imperialist, that's NATO and its allies, and the other side is fighting a just war against imperialism. And Russia and China can't be characterized as imperialist. So that was the reason for the formation of the platform, that at this key moment, we need the working and progressive people around the world to unite, because this is a really important issue, Garland. If you think back to when the Soviet Union collapsed, and you think about the orgy of looting that took place, and if you like me, you're old enough to remember what was going on those times, in the 1980s, the global capitalist system was in an economic crisis, and they saved themselves by looting the resources of the Soviet people. And in doing so, they became so confident and strong. Socialism is gone. There's no one to oppose us. It's a unipolar world now. We can do whatever we want. That was when they launched all their wars. When they had that sense of no one's in our way anymore, they launched their war against the poor in their home countries. They launched wars against every country that tried to remain sovereign against them. And their system of impoverishing the masses and getting wealthy themselves got a huge shot in the arm. So this is what they want to repeat. Their system, again, their economic system is in a massive crisis. The imperialists can see no way out of that except for war and the looting, the unbridled looting of the resources of places which at the moment stand up to them, particularly Russia and China. And everything has to be seen in that context. And if we understand that's what they're trying to do, just think about the consequences of them winning. If they get their way, the poor of the world will suffer 20, 30, 40 more years like we've had since 1990, but worse at a time. We can't stand more of that, Garland. So really, to me, this is the primary issue in the world today. And everyone who can understand that must come together to amplify the voice of anti-imperialism, to strengthen the camp of anti-imperialism against the imperialists who are trying to save themselves. We can't let them win. Really, that's what it's all about.
You know, it sounds to me that one of the things you're discussing here is definitions. It seems to me that this is, you know, I'll just call it Cold War Part 2, as though the first one ever ended, that the adjustment in rhetoric in the second part is to, you know, the same way they claim liberal interventionism, we're starting a war for all these good reasons, they have simply flipped the script on the rhetoric and said, now we've got to start a war again, but this time the reason is, what do you like? Well, I like anti-imperialism. Come to think of it, that's what we're starting it for. What else do you like? You know, just simply taking the rhetoric from the left, taking the rhetoric from the people who stand up for the masses, turning it inside out, and then arguing now that we are anti-imperialist. And it was before communism versus whatever, the good guys. Now it's authoritarianism versus democracy. This is just the same playbook with new rhetoric, it sounds to me.
Absolutely. And, you know, on the one hand, you say, wow, our class enemies, which, you know, I'm a socialist, so I see things very much in those terms, that these people are my class enemies, and they're very clever. They're very sophisticated. And particularly, I live in Britain. We have the oldest established capitalist class. They've been doing this a long time. And they are very adaptable. You know, they will change their face to what they need to do. But on the one hand, you think, oh, God, that's really hard to beat an enemy that's so clever like that. And they've got so many resources to throw at it, you know, to create these think tanks and these fake left organs, to buy up so many organizations of the left and turn them into their mouthpieces. You know, God, that's frustrating. It's difficult. But on the other hand, the fact, Garland, that they feel the need to adopt our rhetoric actually shows that since socialism came into the world, they've been on the back foot. Because before the October Revolution, you and I don't remember that, but you can see how it's happened, you can see how it's happened, that the imperialists used to, you know, British imperialism then was the chief imperialist in the world, and they were open and blatant in their racist rhetoric, in their sexist rhetoric. They said, women are just stupid. You can't expect them to be able to do anything. They said, well, these brown people, they are barbarians and they won't be fit to rule themselves for 1,000 years. They should be grateful to us. We're just better, right? I mean, you know, all these statements that Winston Churchill, for example, made about Indians in the 20th century, you know, pretty horrific, right? But after the October, he had to make them in private. He couldn't make them on the radio anymore. You know, with the way that they used to just announce it to everyone, and we all go, yes, yes, well, we're just superior. They had to change their tune because the Soviet Union, as was, proved that this was all nonsense. And they ended forever the days when people would just meekly accept supremacist ideology. So they had to start to change their tune and say, oh, we're in favor of self-determination for nations. Whose concept was that? That was the Bolsheviks' work. It was the communist work to describe what is a nation and what does self-determination mean and what does it look like and why do we unite with those who are struggling for their independence from the empires. And, you know, all of this, the way that they've had to say, oh, we defend the rights of women, while they're hammering working class women endlessly, they have to talk about defending the rights of women. You know, while they're hammering the oppressed peoples, they have to talk about the right of self-determination. And of course, the fact that they have to do this exposes entirely their weakness and their hypocrisy. Because they are this double speak. Okay, they've got this huge media of network of media where they don't get questioned and they're not called out for their hypocrisy, but people aren't stupid. There's a reason we're all so cynical about the media and politicians these days. It's because there are so many holes in the stories and the narratives they build for us. You've talked really eloquently about that, Garland, that they're constantly presenting us with contradictions.
Yes. Something else I think that is important if you're going to have a discussion about imperialism. Again, we're talking with Joti Brar. She is here to today particularly represent the World Anti-imperialist Forum. And that is, you use the term left, and that is in the same way that the elite ruling class, whatever you want to call them, that they have take some of the terms like imperialism, et cetera. The question becomes now, what's left? Because we now have people in America, like a Joe Biden, like many people, who are opposed to workers uniting, coming together and having trade unions, who are pro concentration of power, pro corporate leadership, pro all of the things that your traditional left espouses, the positions that who oppose viewing the world through the lens of economic class. But they call themselves lefts because of a couple cultural, whether it's the trans issue or they take some cultural issues that are worthy of discussion. Don't get me wrong. I don't think they're worthy of discussion, but they take these issues and they redefine the left from traditional working class, union, trade union, et cetera. And they change it to the point where people have been confused and they're like, well, that person's on the left. And you're like, well, they're so far to the right of me, I couldn't see them if I had binoculars. No, they believe they're espousing the trans issue, whatever the case may be, things of that nature. Your thoughts on the redefinition of the left, and since you're working with the Anti-Imperialist Forum, what can we do to reclaim or refocus people to the traditional perspectives of what would be considered left-leaning politics, really worldwide?
So you're absolutely right to identify this. Obviously, I, as someone who's been working in this communist socialist movement for 30 years, have also been very aware of how this is happening. And actually, I always knew, because Marxism kind of makes it clear for people, and I am a Marxist and I study the works of Marx and Engels and Lenin to understand this world we live in. I think that they hold the key for us to understand what this struggle is all about. It's been very clear to me that this left-right spectrum that we're presented with has always been the spectrum of bourgeois politics. And actually real class, working class politics, the politics of representing the interests of the mass of working people, is not in that spectrum and never has been. So we have always had the Trotskyites presented as the far left. Well, yes, they are the far left of bourgeois politics. Actually, their politics is acceptable to the ruling class. That's why they get talked about. And people like me don't exist in the bourgeois media because we're outside. And I have stopped talking about myself, to be honest with you, as left-wing, a lefty, anything like that. I say I'm a socialist. I do working class politics. That is the politics of the masses against the politics of the bourgeoisie. I'm not here to play the game of bourgeois politics. I'm not a politician in that sense, and to me, it's actually been very helpful in clarifying that, because it was always true. It was always true, but now it's becoming so obvious that you can say it to people and they understand what you're talking about in a way where 20, 30 years ago, when you said it to people, they were like, oh, but I see voices of the left in the media and I see the broad spectrum of opinion. And now they realize that broad spectrum isn't a spectrum. It's just different ways of packaging. It's branding, different ways of branding the same program. And the program is, in your case, defend US imperialism. In my case, defend British imperialism, no matter what. And they have all these different ways of wrapping that up from far left to far right, but it's the same program. So yes, you're absolutely right that we don't identify ourselves with that. Sorry, there might have been another part to your question that I forgot.
No, but that's great. Something, when you say things, it makes my mind pop, right? So one thing I'm thinking, you mentioned US imperialism and British imperialism. Now, in studying over the last few years, some of the political things that have happened, you see the Five Eyes, you see during Russiagate, the extraordinary cooperation between MI6 and the CIA and Italy's group. You see now the U.S. taking using, I would argue they use NATO and the EU as umbrella organizations so that they can control their vassals in Europe. Is there some kind of a line now? Has U.S. imperialism morphed into a worldwide imperialism so much so that you can't really say there's British or U.S. or whatever that the U.S. empire now has, because it feels threatened, has claimed full and complete control over all of the lower elements of the empire. And now US, UK, whatever, if they're under US imperialism, the US is going to say you are let's face it, a pawn to be used and sacrificed if necessary.
It's a really interesting question, isn't it, Garland? Because we can see a world in flux. Now, it's very clear from my perspective that British imperialism realized it was realizing between the wars, and after World War II, it just had to face the fact that it was no longer in a position militarily and economically to be number one imperialist in the world. The US had taken that position. So how was it going to defend? You can't escape the reality that Britain and British finance capital, Britain is home to a huge store, historically accumulated store of finance capital. It has sucked up so much of the world's wealth that it remains a huge financial power in the world. But after World War II, all the old empires, including the British Empire, were on their knees. They had fought 2 world wars. They were losing their colonies. The US, on the other hand, was strengthened by both wars because it wasn't in the middle of the fighting. It was profiteering from everything that was going on. It was building its industry while all the European industry was being destroyed, and building its colonial web while our empires were losing theirs. So there was a shift in the balance of power. And of course, there was the rise of the Soviet Union. And there was the threat of revolution knocking on the door all over Western Europe. Without US intervention, most of Western Europe would have gone communist after the Second World War. That's just a fact. And so in that situation, they accepted US leadership and domination to extent, but a junior partner role in order to survive as imperialists. So Italy is a smaller one, but Germany, France, Britain, these places were still home to huge stores of finance capital and to very powerful financiers, right? But they no longer had the kind of machinery to back up that economic power around the world. And they made an agreement with the USA to be junior partners, to be loyal allies under the US umbrella protectorate. So the US is the biggest imperialist, it gets the biggest chunk of the pie. But does British imperialism, German imperialism, French imperialism still exist? Definitely. Are there contradictions between them? Yes, you can really see that. There was a moment after the collapse of the Soviet Union where it looked like the European Union was going to try and become a rival power to the USA. It was talking a lot about having a European army. It was benefiting from looting the USSR. It was flexing its muscles around the world and starting to feel like, we can be a big power by ourselves now that we're not worried about the threat of socialism. Britain's role as the faithful ally of the USA in the European Union was to quash those plans. And now, of course, when war is on the agenda very seriously, Britain, France, and Germany have no choice but to line up behind the USA because they don't have the military machinery to do things separately. So there is this kind of, I would call it a slightly uneasy alliance. There are contradictions inside that alliance. There is talk about breaking out. Excuse me. There is talk about, you see German, it's creating a lot of contradictions in the ruling classes in each of those countries when they see the price they're paying. But the biggest financiers benefit from this alliance very much because they just want to stay on top, and they don't mind if a lot of the smaller capitalists, who are still quite big but smaller than them, take the brunt, pay the price, as long as they can keep looting the world. And they see the US military machine and the US financial machinery as the mechanism for making that happen. None of them are strong enough on their own. The world imperialist system is not what it was 100 years ago. Right. And this global crisis is bringing that home to everybody. It's a really existential crisis right now. Is this system going to survive? So they're huddling together and they are competing with one another for who is going to pay the price. On the one hand, they're doing everything they can to make the poor pay the price. And on the other hand, when a price has to be paid by employers, it's like the big fish want the little fish to pay, So that's the way I see it.
Let me ask you this also. There's another issue. You look at what's going on with SVB Bank. You look at what's happening with now one of the banks, I believe it's called Republican Bank. In the last 24 hours, they've announced they've lost like $101 billion in withdrawals. Okay. The other part is at the same time that their imperial authority over the world is being challenged, not that China or Russia is saying we want to take we want to take the crown from you, but their existence and their ability to grow is a challenge to someone who wants to dominate everything. The neoliberal capitalist system is crumbling of its own contradictions of financialization as opposed to industrialization, making money through magical derivatives and complex financial tools that even the people that sell them don't understand, as opposed to someone going to the mill every day, like my dad was a longshoreman, putting on a hard hat and going down to the docks and unloading freight and making a living. That's out. But the bottom line is this, what I'm saying is, their issue of imperialism, but the internal collapse of this, let's just say an economic system that doesn't seem to work well for most people is falling apart. Your thoughts?
So fundamentally, what we're seeing is what Marx identified more than 150 years ago. It's a global capitalist crisis of overproduction. And what that basically comes around all the time, and because capitalism is now a global system, there's no way to kind of get yourself out of this contradiction, because it's systemic across the entire world. And the banking activity reflects that. So on the one hand, we have this contradiction where the masses are impoverished by the actions of capital to make more profits by automating and by driving down wages. That's individual capitalists have that incentive, right? I will make more profit if I automate and have to pay less wages. I'll make more profit if I pay fewer wages to my workers, et cetera, et cetera. So you have this process whereby the actions of individual capitalists impoverish the workers as a whole, throw them out of work, make them poorer. On the other hand, all the goods they're producing, in order to be realized into profit, have to be sold to somebody. But you've impoverished the people who are supposed to buy your stuff. This is a contradiction at the very heart of the capitalist system that the capitalists cannot solve, except, well, the way they solve it is to destroy means of production, destroy products, and try and find some way to restart demand in the economy. And now that imperialism is a capitalist imperialism is a global system, that way is war. They have to destroy people, destroy things they've made and can't sell, destroy things, buildings and infrastructure and things that they built before, create a demand via armaments, and then create demand for reconstruction. That is literally the history of the 20th century global economy, right? It's a hideous one. Look at the people whose lives are destroyed in that process. So that's where the imperialists are at right now. This overproduction crisis is so deep and so systemic. And you're talking about these strange activities of the people on Wall Street, this kind of imaginary playing. Essentially, they move from productive activity to gambling because they can't make a profit anymore from productive activity. That's a sign that the overproduction crisis is so deep in the world. We can't just make things that no one's going to buy. So we are gambling with asset price. That's why we get these bubbles of asset prices and land prices. It's all a symptom of the decay of the system. And it's why they're driving to war so hard. And interestingly, the mechanisms they find to kind of kick the can of the crisis down the road all make the crisis deeper. So one of the mechanisms they've been using, especially since 2008, has been money printing. So now they won't let a bank collapse, because that will highlight very obviously to the people that the system is failing. So they print money to bail it out, and it looks like there's a kind of, they've smoothly handled the situation. But how did they handle it? They stole money from the workers and gave it to the bankers, but they did it in a way where you don't notice it straight away, but you notice it over time. The British, the Americans, they were able to export a lot of their inflation for a long time because they have global currencies. How do you have a global currency? Because you're an imperialist power and you can force people to use your money. But now that's coming back to bite them. Fine, you can't do this kind of thing forever. Even my daughters learned about Weimar Germany and what happened when they printed too much money, right? It makes inflation. We are endlessly told. Literally this morning, I was reading an article in The Guardian that the chief economist at the Bank of England is telling the workers, stop asking for higher wages. It's self-defeating. You're making inflation. Marx disproved this idea that high wages make inflation 150 years ago. And our rulers have spent 150 years trying to hide this from us. He disproved it really simply. Anybody can read a couple of pages of what he wrote and understand it. They keep this truth from us. They do everything they can to bury it. And they keep repeating this lie that, oh, it's wages make inflation. It's total nonsense. What high wages do, or higher wages, a rise in wages just means a fall in profit. That is it. Right? But they tell us, oh, no, you're the cause of inflation, while they're printing all this money, which now is a runaway train. And every bank now that's failing, my guess is they're going to keep doing it, although they know they're fueling inflation. They're too terrified of the social result of letting banks start to fall down. So they're just going to,
One of the other things, if you could comment, once again, we're talking with Joti Brar, and she's here representing the World Anti-imperialist Forum. So we're discussing imperialism, and that is imperialism turned inward, which is an interesting thing that we're experiencing now. As an example, traditionally, the imperialism, that you go around the world and you find Africa, Latin America, and blah, 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 and you prey on these people and you extract their resources and you bring it back home. And to some extent, your people are living better than them, and they leave you alone and they turn their back on, they turn their head when you do terrible things. Okay. What we've seen in recent years is the imperialist countries now turning on their own people and preying on their own people, putting them in exorbitant amounts of debt. And one of the things particularly is this, to create a dynamic where and this is a death spin, where the cost of living is so high for the average person. So I'm just Joe worker, and this exorbitant cost of living. But the corporations, industry can no longer afford to be in the United States, because the cost of living, the US has created a dynamic where the cost of living is so high for the individual worker that industry would have to pay that person just to survive so much that they would barely be able to make a profit, or certainly not the profits that they want. What are your thoughts about the how imperialism now has turned inward, and now it's preying on the working class? It always did to some extent, but it seems that is growing and increasing as the empire starts to fall apart and gets more desperate. Your thoughts?
It's really interesting, Garland. I think what you're pinpointing is actually the reversal of the post-World War II gains that were made in all the imperialist countries by the working class populations. So if you look back to the 1930s, Britain, the USA, France, they were all imperialist powers, but the mass of working people lived in penury in those countries. What changed in 1945 was not the nature of imperialism, it was the balance of class forces in the world. So as we said earlier, the Soviet Union, the example of the Soviet Union, which had grown during the 30s when everyone else was going down, which had won the war against fascism, right? Which everybody forgets now, but the Soviet Union and the Chinese were the people who won the world war against fascism in the West and the East, respectively. The prestige, and who had led the resistance all across occupied Europe? The communists. So the prestige of socialism was really high. The demand of workers was for socialism. And let's not forget that the workers at this point were armed and trained in the use of weapons, right? They're not an enemy that you could brush aside lightly. Their demand was for socialism. And what we got was a peace deal from our ruling class. It was a compromise. They said, we'll give you the things that the revolution would give you. You don't have to go through all the trouble of a revolution. We'll give you what you really want. And so we got, for a time, didn't we, secure housing and jobs and decent wages and community facilities and education and healthcare and, a bunch of things that made us feel like, we've made a huge step forward and we're just going to keep going up. And, the ruling class on the back foot, and it's going to stay on the back foot. Now, of course, what the ruling class actually did was buy itself some time. And as the overproduction crisis came back in the 1970s, and as the Soviet Union went into decline and then collapsed, the motivation for keeping up this pay deal to the workers in the imperialist countries was taken away. And they've been with the system in crisis, anything that's not making a profit is an anathema to the ruling class.
Right.
So they're privatizing all the things that for a while were public services. They're cutting back on pay conditions, once more lowering the conditions of the mass of the working class to, global levels, which we are not any longer used to. We got used to the idea that we have a better standard of living than everybody else. We never really asked ourselves why, on what basis. It was actually paid for by giving us a proportion of the loot that was coming in through Wall Street, through the city, to buy social peace so the imperialists could carry on being imperialists.
Wow. Now, something that I think bears discussion, immigration. And one of the things that I've noticed, an opinion of mine, is that the the empire destabilizes countries and impoverishes countries. And ultimately, those people find a way to wander towards where there are jobs and food, which is back to the empire. Now, they then convince the people in the empire that those people are your enemies. So I blow up your country, destabilize your country. The people from your country then come to mine, which then I have cheap labor that I can use to replace the people who I have to pay a higher wage here. And then I convince the people here to be angry at and blame the people whose countries I blew up, who I deliberately brought here for cheap labor. Anyway, your thoughts on the dynamic of immigration, the imperialist dynamic of immigration in this day and age?
I mean, you summed it up beautifully there, Garland. We are being asked to blame the victims for the crime. Now, the truth is that workers on both sides of this artificial divide are victims of exploitation by the same rulers, the same enemy, the same imperialist, capitalist, global, ruling class. So the answer must be in finding a way to unite all of those workers. And to my mind, whatever justification you use for it, scapegoating workers with anti-immigration legislation and measures is not about stopping the immigration. I think that's the first thing we have to understand. The anti-immigration measures are not trying to stop immigration. They're trying to build a story. The story is these people are coming to take your stuff, your job, your services, your whatever, your homes, your wives, whatever people are scared about that is going to be taken, they're taking it. It's their fault. So we are being asked to blame other workers for the fall in our living standards. And of course, the reason that our living standards are falling is capitalist exploitation. Capitalism has inequality baked into its heart. It is a system by which wealth is sucked towards more wealth. And the bigger that wealth becomes of the rich, the more gravity it has. It's sort of like a solar mass. And the more gravity and mass it has, the more wealth it's able to suck towards itself. So inequality and the polarization of the world's wealth and the immiseration of the world's masses is a function of capitalist economics. It's not the fault of the poor people. And as you say, people who follow the wealth that's been looted from their countries back to where it was looted in the hope that they might be able to have a job and raise a family are just doing what is inevitably going to happen when you decimate countries the way imperialism does. So we must find ways to unite. I mean, for example, you'll hear trade unionists complaining that, oh, these people are lowering our pay and conditions and therefore we must stop immigration. No, the way to stop the immigration, while we have capitalism, the immigration won't stop. It just won't. It's a fundamental law of economics. It will carry on. And as you say, this divide between illegal and legal immigrants is helping the capitalists to have this super exploitable substrata of people who have no rights and are terrified in the society where they live to say boo to a goose because they'll get deported, So they live this horrible, precarious existence working for third world wages in a first world country. The only way to protect those people and actually to protect the local populations from what the effect of all of this, which is to drive down pay and conditions for everybody, is to get them in the unions. If every workplace demands that every single person who works there is in the union, then we can bargain collectively, use our collective weight to prevent these terrible effects from happening. That's a fundamental basics of kind of class activity inside the system. That's not even fixing the system. That's just basic ABC, of class struggle. You're a worker in a capitalist system. The only way you have any power is with other workers. So you have to make sure that the group of other workers you're with is as big as possible. And if you let the ruling class divide you, you are going to lose and they are going to win.
I saw someone in the chat say, but they do take our jobs. Okay, that's an exclamatory sentence. They do take our jobs, which let's for the purpose of argument, let's say that's true. I have a headache. Let's say that's true. That's an exclamation. The question becomes, what caused my headache and what am I going to do? How do I fix it? If I have a headache because I slammed my head into a tree, well, that's one thing. If I have a headache because I have a brain tumor, it calls for something different. So when someone says they do take our jobs, the question becomes, okay, that's not in dispute. What is causing that? Do you go hit an immigrant over the head with a shovel? Is that going to stop it? No, you have people who have created a system to deliberately funnel lower paid employees in to take your job. So you're angry at the person and you're ignoring this. This is the way I look at it. Who do you blame? The super rich people who make the policies that bring them in here, or the people who didn't even want to leave their country, except it's been impoverished by imperialism?
Absolutely. So on the one hand, absolutely, one has to blame the system, and therefore one has to work out how to oppose the system and remove the system that's causing all of these problems. And then on a lower level, on a more immediate level, the proximate people who are facilitating the ruling class in this program are our trade union leaders. Where were they when all this was going on? They were encouraging all these divisions and facilitating all these divisions. These people are traitors in our midst. If you want to find someone to really be angry with, be angry at the person who's supposed to be on your side, organizing you to defend yourself, and who actually has been a shill for the ruling class and facilitating its agenda against you.
I certainly agree with that. Your thoughts on the issue of China right now, wherein I think one of the biggest problems is with China as far as Western imperialists is the model that they have found an economic model that is a bit of a hybrid system, a 70-30 hybrid system where they allow some level of a market economy at the same time of a traditional market. At the same time, they have government control of certain things, and it seems to be growing faster than any other economy in the world. And it seems to me the big anger at China is that they're doing something that's working, and how can you keep arguing this doesn't work at the time they're growing 5 times faster than you are? Joti.
Well, yeah, that's certainly galling for the imperialists, isn't it? I mean, fundamentally, I don't think that the targeting of China is about its system. I think the targeting of China is about the desperate need of the imperialists to suppress its independence and loot its resources. They, like with Russia, which is not communist or socialist in any way, they want to break it up because it's too big and too strong. They want to loot its resources rather than buying them in fair trade because they need the source of super profits that they're absolutely desperate for, because, as we talked about, their system is failing. And I think that's been made clear. You know, China has tried to be a good partner, just like Russia has tried to deal in as equals on the world stage, to take part in the world global economy, to be in the WTO and the WHO and the United Nations and all these, to play by what the USA and its allies say are the rules. But it turns out they don't respect the rules themselves. What they mean is our hegemony. And they will, you're a democracy if you are under our domination, and you're a dictatorship if you're not. And that essentially, that's what's become clear. And increasingly, you've seen the Russians and the Chinese both over recent years wake up to this fact. There's nothing we can do that's going to appease these people and stop them targeting us, apart from lie down and allow ourselves to be looted. And I genuinely believe that that's fundamentally what's at the heart of it, not their economic system. I think whether they were socialist or if they were fully capitalist, it wouldn't make a difference while they remained with an independent mindset and the goal of retaining their own sovereignty and independence.
I think you're right. It's interesting when you talk about what system Russia has. Is it capitalist? Is it socialist? Having traveled throughout South America, people talk about South American and Bolivarian socialism. And what do I think the people in South America want? And I say, I've talked to them. And basically what they like is their resources, whether it's lithium or gold or whatever. They want the government to nationalize these resources and to use the profit from nationalized resources to finance a strong social safety net. That's pretty simple what they want. It makes sense that they would align with Russia, because while Russia says it's a traditional capitalist country to some extent, but look what it does. It has very large nationalized companies that sell the resources of the, whatever, be it gold or lithium or whatever. Oh, they got all kinds of stuff, oil, gas, and they use that money to finance the government. And so they don't have astronomical taxes and all of the things that we have now that are additional taxes. All of we've got like red light cameras and stop sign cameras and all these extra things that they do to tax you in a sly way. And you don't see those things in Russia. What do you think about what I would argue somewhat of a hybrid economic system in Russia, and that concept that some countries have, particularly in South America, and I would argue Africa would like to follow that model? Utilize the natural resources of your country with nationalized corporations to finance a strong social safety net.
So that's basically welfare capitalism you're talking about.
Okay.
And it does some things, but not others. So,
Okay.
it doesn't get rid of inequality, it doesn't get rid of unemployment, but it can ameliorate the difficulties that are caused by the inequality that comes with capitalist production. And that's essentially what you're seeing. Now, what I find interesting or significant about what happens in anti-imperialist countries, and I think it's one of the ways in which you can see that Russia is an anti-imperialist country, is in order to stand up for yourself, you're taking on the might, you're attracting the enmity of a huge, powerful player in the world. The biggest, most powerful bloc on the planet is the imperialist NATO alliance, no doubt about that. Still to this point, militarily and economically, although as we can see, they're becoming shaky. But it's a big deal to take on and attract their enmity. They have a lot of weapons to throw at you, financial, diplomatic, military, all kinds of things. And we've seen the way that wars have been launched against countries that tried to remain sovereign in the last 20, 30 years. So it's not a small thing. It's a big enemy to face off against. And if you're going to try to retain some national sovereignty against imperialism, you are going to need the support of the masses. You can't have the masses against you and the imperialists against you. You won't survive. So everywhere, no matter what the social system, from China to Russia to Venezuela to Nicaragua to Iran, the DPRK, wherever you're looking, whatever the social system, those countries who try to or struggle for their sovereignty, their independence, and who say, no, we are going to go our own way, and it's going to be the way that we decide, not the way that you force on us. They have to mobilize the masses, and that means they have to deliver something for the masses. So I kind of see it in that context, that in order to have the broad masses on their side against imperialism, they have to give them something. They have to, take away the worst effects that a capitalist economy has in terms of impoverishing people. For example, in lots of those countries, you'll find basic staple foodstuffs will be subsidized. You'll find that, healthcare will be subsidized, education will be subsidized, housing will be subsidized. That doesn't mean that it's no longer a market economy. I mean, Britain had all those things as part of the welfare state for a certain period of time. They're big concessions made to the working class in order to bring about some national unity, essentially. That's the way that I see that.
I tend to think this too. If you look at, from a perspective of history and a timeline of history, it has been truly amazing how quickly Russia has returned to prominence from being totally, disemboweled by the imperialists in the 1990s. And I believe that is a result of my experience with a lot of Russians is that the Soviet Union educated the people very well.
Yes.
And that as a result of that, they lost their money and they got robbed, but they had a lot of educated, very knowledgeable people, and they were able to do that. When the last time I was in Venezuela and, traveled out to these small towns, out poor people out in the mountains. And when I talked to them, I was just amazed at their knowledge of politics, et cetera. And they said, well, that was part of the Chavez revolution, which was to get people knowledgeable, to teach people history, et cetera. And it taught me the importance of education, and I can see the U.S. falling apart as we don't educate our people. Anyway, your thoughts on the imperialism and education?
Well, the thing is, the imperialists can't give the mass of the people a real education, because a real education would turn a whole lot of people who are unemployed or underemployed or suffering from bad situations, and understanding that it's not their fault that they're on the scrap heap. It's the system's fault, and imperialism can't have that. So we have to imbibe from very young this idea that some of us are just useless, and that's why our lives are never going to amount to anything. Is because we have failed and we didn't do the right thing, and etc. So on the one hand, that's the way the ruling class in the imperialist countries uses their education system to kind of train just enough people to do as they're told. Cream those people off and they're going to get jobs, and the rest of them, they have to have this mindset that says it's my fault that I didn't get on in this world. I had the opportunities, but somehow I failed to take them because I'm not clever enough or didn't work hard enough or whatever that is. On the other hand, you pointed to the Soviet Union and what it did. Now, the Soviet Union had the most phenomenal education system. I would recommend to your listeners to hunt out a book. There's still quite a lot of copies around called Diary of a Russian School Teacher, which comes out of the post-World War II period of the Soviet Union. A really beautiful account of what an education system that cares about education looks like and feels like. And of course, you're right. Whilst the economic system of socialism was dismantled in the USSR, they couldn't take away everything it had done to people's minds. And on top of the fact that people were highly educated in a really decent education system that didn't just disappear overnight, they also had a mentality of human dignity. You can't just turn those people into slaves overnight and expect that to just go down, like they're just going to take it. It's like, oh, yes, okay, well, now I'm a colonized people. It's a huge country, Russia. I think it was not at all surprising that after a certain amount of chaos and the imperialists looting the country, the Russian national bourgeoisie got up and said, we don't have to take this. I don't want to be a comprador for the West. Why should I be? You know, we as a people have a history and a dignity that we've built ourselves. You know, the ethos of building yourself a nation that came from the Soviet period, you know, when the working people built a great power by their own labors without exploiting anybody anywhere, you know, and the wonderful, you know, developments and advances in every field of science and culture that you can possibly think of that were made in the Soviet period, you know, that leaves its mark on people. So I don't think it's very surprising that, you know, some of that is reasserting itself in the mentality. And, you know, this is one of the things that imperialism does to anti-imperialist countries. It makes it clear that there really is only one way out. Socialism ultimately, you know, all these concessions to the masses, what they're about, it's a recognition that, you know, if you want to oppose imperialism, really the only way to properly do it is by taking steps towards socialism. And ultimately, the only way to free ourselves from all this, you know, poverty, insecurity, misery, inequality, war, all of these things that come with capitalism is to just jettison the whole system and create a planned economy for the benefit of the people. That's socialism.
Thank you very much, Joti Brar. Where can people go to find out more about what you're doing, find out more about the World Anti-imperialist Forum, etc.?
So the World Anti-imperialist Platform has a website. It's wap21.org. We recently also launched a news service, an anti-imperialist news website called WAP News, wapnews.org, I think that is. And yes, wapnews.org. They're just in the process of launching a Telegram channel. So I'd ask people to look for that Platform News. You can follow me on Telegram. I also have a Telegram channel, Joti Brar. Always interested in people's comments and feedback on the things I'm talking about there. Just to let you know briefly, Garland, if I may, the World Anti-imperialist Platform has a founding document called the Paris Declaration. And I would ask everybody listening to go and find that declaration. If it makes sense to you, if you agree with it, talk to the people who represent you politically, you know, and try to get them on board with that. We need to build a big movement that clearly identifies who are our friends and who are our enemies and brings together as many organizations as possible who understand that and are prepared to bring that understanding to the mass of the workers in the world who are being bombarded with a massive psychological operation to make them feel that their enemies are their friends and their friends are their enemies. And it's really against the interests of working people not to take a side in this war. Oh, yeah, that's it. Lovely. Thank you.
There you go. A platform. That's it. It's WAP, World Anti-imperialist Platform News.org. And there we have all kinds of things going on there. I'll be checking it out. You know, as you probably know, since I'm a journalist, I check out every possible news site that I can find daily. I'm going to add that to my list, and I certainly appreciate you taking some busy time out of your schedule. And I hope to have the opportunity to interview you again soon.
Fabulous.
And look, I need to talk to you anyway because I've got a show, a couple. You know, I've got traditional shows, a Pacifica show in Washington, D.C. and one in Los Angeles, California. I think the people in L.A. really need to hear from you. So I'll be in touch and we'll talk again soon, hopefully, if you're busy. I also, let me ask you this. Do you know a lot about India?
Not that much.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Well, maybe you can point to me.
Yeah,
because I'd like to talk to someone about India, where India fits in this reordering, in this multipolar, the multipolar changes. So I'll be in touch if you can find someone who, you know, maybe could talk to. I think India is very, very important right now. And one of the things I say is this. India recognizes something. They aspire, that country aspires to be a world power. And it's watching saying, well, my gosh, we're looking at the rise of world powers and how the US empire reacts to that. We have to know that if we aspire to be a world power, if we get another leg, when they get finished with Russia and China, if they were to be successful taking them out, clearly we're next on the menu. But at any rate, thanks a lot. World Anti-imperialist Platform. Go to wapnews.com. And what's the other websites?
wap21.org.
wap21.org. All right. Thanks a lot, Joti. Great talking to you. I really enjoyed it. And let's talk again soon.